Hey guys, tonight we're settling into something deceptively simple. Sleep. Specifically, how you try to sleep when the sky is actively trying to erase you. You're in the Old West now, long before weather apps, emergency alerts, or even reliable forecasts. Out here, a clear afternoon can turn into a white shrieking nightmare by sundown. And just to set expectations early, you probably won't survive this. At least not every version of you that tried. Plenty of settlers didn't. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing on a stretch of plains that seemed reasonable in summer. The grass was tall then, the soil rich, the sky generous. Now it's winter, and the horizon has disappeared. There's no night in the usual sense, just darkness thickened by snow. The wind doesn't blow so much as assault. It howls, shrieks, and slams itself against anything vertical, like it has a personal grudge. Somewhere in this chaos is your cabin, and inside that cabin is the only place you might be able to sleep without dying. The idea of sleep during a blizzard is already strange. Sleep is vulnerability. Sleep means lowering your guard while the temperature drops and the walls creak and the roof groans under accumulating weight. But you're exhausted. Not modern tired. This is bone-deep fatigue from hauling water, chopping frozen wood, and burning calories just to stay warm. Your body demands rest even when your mind is screaming that rest might be fatal. You push inside and seal the door as best you can. This isn't a snug modern seal. It's wood warped by seasons, stuffed with rags, maybe a buffalo hide nailed along the edges. Historically, many settlers used whatever they had, old clothing, newspaper, even dried grass, to plug gaps. One real fact that often surprises people is that frontier cabins were rarely airtight by design. A little airflow reduced moisture buildup and smoke accumulation, but in a blizzard, that same airflow could mean hypothermia. The balance was crude and deadly. As night settles, or whatever passes for night in this endless storm, you prepare to sleep. You don't change clothes. No one does. Pyjamas are a luxury you won't see for generations. You wear everything you own. Wool shirt, extra socks, maybe a coat if it's bad enough. This isn't comfort layering, it's survival math. Each layer traps a little more heat, and heat is time. Time is life. You lie down on a bed that would insult your spine on a good day. Maybe it's a rope bed, where thick cords sag under your weight, topped with straw or corn husks. Maybe it's just a pallet on the floor, mattresses stuffed with feathers. Existed. But on the frontier they were rare and expensive. A quirky but true detail is that some settlers preferred straw ticks, not just because they were cheap, but because they could be burned if lice took over. An extreme but effective form of pest control. The wind gets louder as you try to relax. It finds gaps you didn't know existed. The walls vibrate. Snow hisses as it forces its way into cracks, melting just enough to make everything damp before freezing again. You listen because listening is a form of vigilance. Many settlers slept lightly during storms, trained to wake at any change in sound. A sudden silence could mean the wind had shifted, loading snow against one wall. That was dangerous. Roof collapse was a real risk, and there's scholarly debate about how often cabins actually failed structurally, versus how often fear exaggerated the threat in memory and storytelling. Your breathing slows, but your mind keeps working. You think about fire. The stove is your heart, your sun. But letting it burn all night carries risks. Carbon monoxide was an invisible killer long before anyone had a name for it. Settlers knew, in a practical way, that bad air could take you in your sleep. There are diary entries describing people cracking doors open during storms despite the cold, just to be safe. The debate among historians is whether these practices were widespread knowledge or learned through brutal trial and error. Outside, the storm erases direction. If you stepped out now, you could walk in a circle and never know it. This isn't poetic exaggeration. During the Great Plains blizzards, people were found frozen within yards of their homes, disoriented by blowing snow. Knowing that, you stay inside. You commit to the idea that this cabin, flimsy as it is your entire universe tonight. Sleep comes in fragments. You drift, then jolt awake when the wind slams something loose. You dream of warmth, of summer fields, of quiet. Then the cold seeps in again, and you pull your limbs closer to your core. Curling up isn't childish here, it's instinct. It reduces surface area, conserving heat. Another historical fact: many settlers slept in positions we'd now associate with anxiety because it physically helped them survive low temperatures. There's a strange intimacy to this kind of night. If you're not alone, you're close enough to feel another person breathe. Families slept together not for comfort, but for warmth. Body heat mattered. Privacy vanished in winter, replaced by necessity. Some accounts mention arguments sparked by the simple act of someone rolling over and letting cold air in. Sleep here is communal negotiation. Eventually, exhaustion outweighs fear. Your body decides for you. You sink into a shallow, watchful sleep, aware of the storm even as dreams flicker. This is what passing the night looks like. Not peace, not rest, but endurance disguised as rest. You're not conquering the blizzard. You're waiting it out, one breath at a time, hoping the walls hold and the fire behaves, and the morning, when it comes, still recognizes your cabin as something worth uncovering. The night never really ends. It just loosens its grip slightly. When you surface from that thin survival-grade sleep, it's not because you're rested. It's because something has changed. The wind's pitch is different now, lower somehow, like it's taken a breath. That alone is enough to pull you awake. Out here, subtle shifts are alarms. You don't move right away. Moving wastes heat. You lie still, listening, cataloguing sounds the way you've learned to do. The stove ticks softly as metal contracts. Somewhere above you, snow slides along the roof with a muffled sigh. That sound is both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because it means the roof is shedding weight. Terrifying because sometimes it doesn't shed enough. Cabins in the Old West were rarely standardized. One might be squared logs with mud chinking, another rough planks scavenged from a rail stop 100 miles away. What they shared was improvisation. To survive blizzards, settlers added weight to their roofs, stones, logs, even barrels filled with dirt, to keep them from lifting in gale-force winds. This is a real, documented practice, though historians still debate how effective it actually was versus how much it simply made people feel safer. Feeling safer mattered. It helped you sleep, and sleep kept you alive. You sit up slowly, joints protesting. The cold has settled into your bones like a tenant that refuses to leave. Your breath clouds the air, hanging there longer than it should. That tells you the fire is dying. You debate whether to feed it. Every decision at night is a trade-off. Stoke the fire and you risk sparks, smoke, or bad air. Let it die, and the cold creeps closer to your core. Eventually you add a log. Just one. You do it carefully, opening the stove only long enough to slide it in. Sparks flare briefly, bright and almost cheerful, before settling down. That flash of light feels like a small victory. You close the door and listen again, making sure the draft pulls smoke upward. This ritual, this hyper-awareness, was common. Settlers didn't tend fires casually. At night, especially during storms, fire management was an active skill, one learned the hard way. You lie back down, pulling a blanket over your shoulders. It smells faintly of animals and smoke and damp wool. Most blankets out here are wool, sometimes mixed with hair. They're heavy, scratchy, and life-saving. There's a fringe detail historians love to mention. Some settlers slept under buffalo robes, which were incredibly warm but also so heavy they could trap someone if they shifted poorly. There are debated accounts of people waking in panic, unable to move at first, convinced the storm had collapsed the roof. Outside, the blizzard continues its work. Snow piles against the cabin walls, insulating them even as it threatens to block the door. This creates a strange thermal effect. Buried cabins could actually become warmer, the snow acting like an igloo's shell. Some settlers noticed this and stopped clearing snow immediately during prolonged storms. Scholars still argue whether this was intentional strategy or just exhaustion rationalized after the fact. Your sleep comes again, uneven but deeper. Dreams blur with reality. You dream of the wind speaking, of the cabin shrinking, of warmth just out of reach. Then you wake because the silence is too loud. The wind has paused, not stopped. Paused. This is often the most dangerous moment. Without wind, the cold sharpens. Temperatures can plummet in the stillness after a blizzard's peak. You feel it instantly, like the air itself has teeth. You tuck your hands under your arms, a small, instinctive movement. Fingers are always the first to go. Frostbite doesn't announce itself dramatically. It starts as numbness, then a strange waxy feeling. Settlers sometimes went to sleep with cold extremities and woke up permanently changed. There's ongoing debate about how much people understood frostbite versus how often they misattributed damage to bad circulation or age. Either way, you're careful. You wiggle your toes, you clench and unclench your fists. Just enough movement to remind them you're still here. If you're sharing the cabin, there's murmured communication in the dark. Not full conversations, just checks. A cough, a whispered name, a reassurance that everyone's still breathing. In families, adults often rotated light watches during severe storms. One person stayed half awake, listening for trouble while others slept. This practice is mentioned in multiple frontier journals, though historians debate whether it was truly systematic or simply remembered that way because it feels orderly in hindsight. Time stretches. Without clocks you trust, night becomes elastic. An hour feels like 3. You mark time by the fire's behaviour, by how often you need to shift to stay warm, by the ache in your hips from the hard bed. Sleep here isn't a destination, it's a series of brief truces between you and the cold. At some point, exhaustion wins again. Your body prioritises unconsciousness over fear. This is both a gift and a risk. There are accounts of people who slept too deeply and didn't wake up. Carbon monoxide, hypothermia, simple failure to stir and add a log, death crept in quietly. You don't know that yet. You just know your eyelids are heavy, and the storm hasn't taken the cabin, and for now that's enough. When you wake again, there's the faintest change in the quality of darkness. Not light exactly, but less absence of it. Morning is thinking about happening. You're stiff, sore, alive, you don't move yet. You listen. You always listen first. Because surviving the night doesn't mean the danger is over. It just means you've earned the chance to face whatever the blizzard left behind. Morning doesn't arrive so much as seep in. You notice it in the way the darkness thins like ink diluted with water. Your eyes open before you mean them to. Cold does that. It pulls you back to consciousness whether you're ready or not. The first thing you do before moving, before speaking, is breathe and count. One breath, then another. If your chest rises easily, if your head feels clear enough, you mark it as a win. This simple self-check is instinct now. People who didn't do it sometimes never got the chance to do anything else. You sit up slowly. Too fast and the world tilts, blood sluggish from cold and dehydration. Settlers drank less in winter, not because they needed less water, but because water was harder to get and often frozen solid. There's a real historical pattern of winter dehydration contributing to fatigue and confusion, though it rarely shows up plainly in diaries. It's something historians infer from symptoms described without explanation. Dizziness, headaches, strange lethargy blamed on the cold itself. The cabin feels smaller in daylight, or what passes for it. Snow presses against the windows, muting the outside world. If the storm was bad enough, there might be no light at all coming through, just a dull glow. That's when you know you're buried. This isn't panic-inducing, not anymore. You've learned that being snowed in can be safer than being exposed. Snow insulates. Wind can't reach you if it can't find you. You swing your legs over the edge of the bed and stand, feet protesting against the cold floor. Shoes go on immediately. Going barefoot, even briefly, is how you lose toes. This was common knowledge, passed down in warnings rather than manuals. One quirky frontier habit was sleeping with boots loosened but on, especially during storms, so you could stand instantly if something went wrong. Some scholars argue this was exaggerated in later retellings, but enough first-hand accounts mention it that you take it seriously. You move to the door, but don't open it yet. Opening it blindly could mean a face full of snow, or worse, destabilizing a drift that's holding up the wall. Instead, you check the stove. The fire is mostly ash now, a faint warmth lingering like a memory. You stir it gently, coaxing embers back to life with careful breaths and a sliver of wood. Fire starting after a stormy night is an art. Too much enthusiasm and you choke it. Too little and it dies. This moment, reviving heat, is often described with near-religious gratitude in settler journals. Once the cabin warms a fraction, you assess the damage. Cracks have widened. Dampness has frozen into lace-like patterns along the walls. Ice feathers bloom where breath met wood all night. This is beautiful in a quiet, dangerous way. You admire it briefly, then remind yourself that beauty doesn't mean safety. If you're not alone, everyone moves slowly, stiffly, speaking in low voices. Children are checked first. Their cheeks are rubbed gently, noses inspected. Frostbite on a child was every settler's nightmare, not just for the injury itself, but because medical help was often days away. There's ongoing debate about how effective home remedies were. Rubbing snow on frostbitten skin, for example, was once common and is now known to be harmful. Back then, you did what you'd been told, what your parents did, what the neighbour swore by. Eventually you turn back to the door. This is a moment of commitment. You brace yourself, then push. If snow has piled high, the door barely moves. Sometimes it doesn't move at all. That's when you dig out through a window or a chimney access. It's not dramatic. It's slow, methodical work, hands numbing as you scoop snow away. The outside world reveals itself inch by inch. When you finally step out, or at least look out, you're greeted by a landscape that doesn't resemble the one you went to sleep in. Fences are gone, paths erased. The world is smooth and blindingly white, sculpted by wind into shapes that feel intentional. Silence hangs heavy. After a blizzard, sound behaves differently. It's absorbed, softened. You speak, and your voice feels like it doesn't belong here. Sleep during the storm now feels distant, almost unreal. But you know it mattered. Those broken hours of rest kept you functional enough to dig out, to check on others, to start again. Settlers who failed to sleep at all often made fatal mistakes the next day. Overexertion, poor decisions, wandering off disoriented. There's scholarly discussion about whether sleep deprivation contributed significantly to post-storm deaths, but the pattern is there, written between the lines of survival stories. You look back at the cabin, this rough structure that held against the wind. You slept inside it, not well, not comfortably, but enough to still be here. The blizzard didn't end your story. It just added another layer to it, like snow on a roof, weighty, dangerous, but survivable if you're careful. As you step fully into the morning, muscles aching, eyes squinting against the glare, you carry that night with you. Not as fear, but as knowledge. You know now how thin the line is between sleep and death out here. And you know that when the next storm comes, and it will, you'll lie down again, wrapped in wool and resolve, listening to the wind, trusting yourself to wake when it matters. The day after a blizzard isn't a recovery day. It's a reckoning. You move through it slowly, not because you want to, but because your body insists. Every joint feels rusted. Sleep gave you survival, not comfort. That distinction matters now as you take stock of what the night cost you. Your first task is fuel. Firewood disappears quickly during storms, and blizzards have a habit of burying the very piles meant to save you. You dig with gloved hands, feeling for the familiar shapes beneath the snow. Wood that looks dry can still be frozen solid, and frozen wood burns poorly. Settlers learn to stack fuel in ways that shed snow and wind, sometimes leaning it against the cabin itself. There's debate among historians about whether this increased fire risk or reduced winter deaths overall. Like many frontier choices, it traded one danger for another. Inside, the cabin smells different now. Stale, damp, smoky. This is the smell of survival, though no one would call it pleasant. You open what ventilation you can without losing too much heat. Airing out a cabin after a storm was crucial. People who didn't sometimes complained of headaches and nausea for days, symptoms we now recognise as mild carbon monoxide exposure. Back then, it was just winter sickness. You think again about sleep. Not last night's sleep, but tonight's. Blizzards rarely travel alone. They come in systems, waves of punishment. You know you'll need rest again, and soon. This knowledge shapes how you move through the day. You conserve energy. You eat more fat if you have it. Salt pork, lard, Whatever's available. High-calorie food wasn't indulgence, it was insulation from the inside. There's a strange mental shift that happens after surviving a night like that. Fear dulls, replaced by practicality. You don't dwell on how close it came. You focus on routines. This psychological adaptation is something historians point to when discussing frontier resilience. There's debate over whether settlers were uniquely tough or simply had no alternative. You suspect it's the second one. Toughness grows where options disappear. As evening approaches again, you prepare for sleep differently than you did before the storm. Lessons were learned. Gaps get stuffed more thoroughly. Bedding is rearranged. If there are children, they're placed in the warmest spot furthest from walls. If there are animals, dogs, sometimes even chickens, they're brought inside. This wasn't sentimental. Livestock provided heat, and heat was currency. There are accounts of cows kept in attached sheds specifically so their body warmth could bleed into living spaces. Scholars still argue about how effective this really was, but people believed in it, and belief can be comforting. When you lie down that second night, the wind is quieter, but the cold is sharper. Clear skies mean temperatures drop hard. You sleep more deeply now, not because it's safer, but because exhaustion has accumulated. Your body claims what it's owed. You dream less, or maybe you just don't remember them. This is how settlers slept during deadly blizzards and after them. Not heroically, not peacefully, but deliberately. Sleep was planned, guarded, rationed. It was a tool, as essential as an axe or a stove. And each time you survived the night, you refined the method a little more. You pull the blanket tighter, feel the weight of it press you into the bed, anchoring you. Outside, the land waits, patient and indifferent. Inside, you close your eyes again, knowing now that sleep isn't escape, it's preparation. By the fifth night after a major storm, or sometimes the very next one, because the weather out here doesn't respect narrative pacing, you've learned something important. The bed itself matters more than you ever expected. Not comfort, not softness, but structure. What you sleep on can decide how much heat you keep, and how much pain you wake up with. And pain, unchecked, drains energy just as surely as cold. You look at your bed differently now. It's not furniture, it's insulation. If it's a rope bed, the cords have sagged unevenly, creating pockets where cold air settles. Settlers complained about this constantly. A real historical detail is that many people retightened rope beds every winter, using a wooden key to twist the ropes back into tension. The phrase, sleep tight, likely comes from this practice, though scholars still debate whether that etymology is folk myth or linguistic fact. Either way, you do what you can. You shift straw, redistribute weight, minimize drafts underneath. If the bed is on the floor, that's a problem too. Cold sinks. The ground steals heat relentlessly. People learned to elevate themselves however possible. Stacked boards, crates, even flat stones. Some slept on tables during extreme cold, preferring awkward height to frozen bones. There's a fringe but persistent account of settlers hanging hammocks indoors during blizzards, copied from naval practice. It wasn't common, but when it worked well, keeping bodies suspended away from the coldest air. You stuff extra material beneath you. Spare clothes, sacks, dried grass, newspaper if you have it. Paper was valuable not for reading, but for blocking air. This isn't something you'd guess unless you lived it. Blankets on top help, but warmth lost downward is warmth gone forever. Sleep improves noticeably when you get this right. Not good sleep, just less punishing sleep. When you finally lie down, your body knows the routine now. You curl slightly, not from fear, but efficiency. Knees drawn in, spine rounded just enough to protect your core. This posture shows up repeatedly in descriptions of winter sleep on the frontier, though writers rarely explain it. They don't need to. Anyone who's done it understands. Your head rests on something that barely qualifies as a pillow, a sack of clothes, a folded coat. Feathers were luxurious, and even then they flattened quickly. Still, elevating your head matters. Smoke hangs low sometimes. Carbon monoxide too. Sleeping slightly raised could mean the difference between waking up and not. This wasn't scientific knowledge. It was observational, passed down in warnings and habits. Don't sleep flat by the stove wasn't advice, it was survival law. As you drift off, your mind does a quiet inventory. Fingers, toes, face. You brush a hand across your cheek, feeling for numbness. You breathe into your cupped hands, warming them before tucking them under the blanket. These small rituals are calming. They give you something to do while sleep approaches, something that feels like control. Outside, the night is clear again. Stars burn with unnatural sharpness. That's another thing settlers noticed. Colder nights seemed brighter. There's debate among historians and scientists about whether this was perception or reality. Clear air, less moisture. But the belief itself mattered. Bright stars meant brutal cold. You pull the blanket tighter in response, even if it's already snug. Sleep comes faster now, but it's heavier too. Your body sinks into it like a stone into dark water. This depth is dangerous. You know it. Somewhere in the back of your mind. Deep sleep conserves energy, but it also dulls awareness. That's why people sometimes set crude alarms. A pot balanced precariously, a string tied to a door that would rattle if the wind shifted it. These early warning systems were inconsistent, but they offered peace of mind. And peace of mind in winter is worth a lot. You dream of weight. Not crushing, just present. Snow pressing against walls, blankets pressing against your chest, the bed holding you just enough. When you wake briefly, you don't panic anymore. You adjust, breathe, sink back down. This is adaptation in real time. By morning, you'll be sore again. You always are. But soreness means circulation, and circulation means life. As you lie there in the dark, wrapped in wool and resolve, you understand something settlers rarely wrote explicitly. Sleeping through deadly blizzards wasn't about bravery. It was about learning how to lie still in the least harmful way possible, trusting that stillness itself could be an act of survival. At some point you stop thinking of clothing as something you wear during the day and remove at night. That idea belongs to another life, another climate. Out here, clothing is a mobile shelter, and when the blizzards come, you sleep inside it the same way you sleep inside the cabin. Layered, strategic, never casual. You don't undress before bed. You subtract maybe, but you never strip down. Damp layers come off if you can spare them, because moisture is dangerous. Sweat freezes. Breath condenses. A shirt that felt fine while chopping wood can become a sheet of ice by midnight. Settlers learned this through bitter experience. There are diary entries describing people waking to find their clothing stiff with frost, shaped like their bodies even after removal. Historians debate how common this was, but the descriptions are vivid enough that you believe them. You change into your night layers, which are really just the driest things you own. Wool is prized, cotton kills, though no one phrases it that way yet. They just know cotton stays wet and cold. Wool insulates even when damp, and it doesn't cling to the skin the same way. This is one of those historical facts that feels modern because it's still true. Settlers didn't know the chemistry, but they knew the result. Socks matter more than almost anything. You double them if you can, triple them if you're lucky. Feet are vulnerable in sleep because they're far from your core and easy to forget. There are stories, quiet ones, often mentioned in a line and never revisited, of people losing toes after a single night. Not from exposure outside, but from sleeping in inadequate layers. Scholars argue about whether frostbite during sleep was more common than frostbite during travel. The evidence is incomplete, but the fear was real enough to shape behaviour. You tuck your pants into your socks, your shirt into your pants. This isn't about fashion. It's about stopping cold air from circulating. Settlers created their own version of a sealed system. Fabric overlapping fabric. Gaps eliminated wherever possible. Some even wrapped scarves or strips of cloth around wrists and ankles before bed. It looked excessive. It wasn't. Your coat might stay on too, especially if it's fur-lined. Fur traps air better than woven fabric, and air is what you're really collecting. Each pocket of warmth is a small victory. There's a fringe detail historians like to point out. People sometimes slept with hats pulled low over their eyes, not just for warmth, but to prevent eyelashes from freezing together. It sounds extreme until you imagine waking up and realizing your eyes won't open properly. Gloves are tricky. You want your hands covered, but not so tightly that circulation suffers. Mittens are better than gloves, a fact settlers learned long before science explained it. Fingers sharing warmth survive longer. You ball your hands into loose fists inside the mittens, tucking them against your chest or under your arms. This position shows up again and again in winter survival accounts, almost always without explanation. It doesn't need one. When you finally lie down, fully dressed, layered like a bundle of supplies rather than a person, you feel heavier. Movement is restricted. Turning over takes effort. This can be unsettling at first. There's a brief, instinctive panic. What if you need to move quickly? What if something happens? But you remind yourself that exposure is the greater threat. Immobility is safer than cold. Your breathing sounds louder inside all these layers. You listen to it, slow and steady. The rhythm becomes something to hold on to. Some settlers used breathing intentionally to calm themselves before sleep, though they wouldn't have described it that way. Prayer served a similar function: repetition, rhythm, familiarity. These mental habits are as much a part of sleeping through blizzards as blankets and walls. As the night deepens, you wake occasionally to adjust. A sleeve rides up, a sock loosens, you fix it immediately. Small drafts feel enormous when you're half asleep. This hyper-awareness never fully leaves you, even as exhaustion pulls you back under. It's tiring, but it's effective. By morning, your clothes will smell of smoke and sweat and damp wool. They'll be creased from sleeping in them, shaped by your body's curled posture. You'll wear them again anyway. There's no clean break between night and day out here, just a continuation of endurance. As you drift off again, wrapped in every layer you own, you understand something simple and profound. During deadly blizzards in the Old West, settlers didn't sleep beside their survival tools. They slept inside them, and if they woke up at all, that meant the system worked. By now, you've learned that warmth isn't something you generate alone. No matter how many layers you wear or how carefully you tend the fire, there's a limit to what one body can do against winter. During deadly blizzards, settlers crossed an invisible line between privacy and survival, and on the other side of that line, everyone sleeps closer than they ever expected to. You don't ask whether people want to sleep together. You just start rearranging. Beds are pushed closer. Pallets are laid side by side. Children are placed in the centre like living embers, radiating heat outward. Adults take the edges, acting as buffers against the cold seeping from walls and floors. This arrangement appears again and again in first-hand accounts, though rarely framed emotionally. It's described like stacking firewood, practical, efficient, unquestioned. There's a real historical reason for this. Human bodies give off heat continuously, and in a small space that heat accumulates. One person alone struggles to warm the air around them. Several people together can raise the temperature of a closed room by degrees. Historians agree on this effect, though they debate how consciously settlers understood it. Some argue it was intuitive, others think it was learned painfully, after nights spent shivering alone. You feel it almost immediately once everyone settles. The air grows thicker, warmer, faintly humid. Breath overlaps breath. Blankets overlap bodies. There's an initial awkwardness, elbows, knees, someone's cold foot pressing against your calf, but no one complains. Complaining wastes energy, and energy is life. Sleep sounds change when people are packed together. Breathing synchronizes in strange ways. One person snores, another mutters in their dreams, a child whimpers and then settles when a hand rests on their back. These sounds become reassuring. Silence now would be worse. Silence means someone stopped breathing, or the storm has shifted into something more dangerous. You're aware of every movement. When someone turns, you all feel it. When someone wakes, you sense it before they speak. This shared awareness makes sleep lighter, but safer. There's always someone half awake, even if no one planned it that way. Scholars sometimes call this collective vigilance, and they debate whether it was intentional or simply emergent behaviour. From the inside, it doesn't feel like theory. It feels like instinct. There's also an emotional warmth that sneaks in, uninvited. Fear softens when it's shared. You don't dwell on it. You don't have language for it, but it's there. During storms that killed neighbours and erased landmarks, being pressed shoulder to shoulder with living people mattered in ways that went beyond temperature. Some historians argue that these moments shaped frontier communities more than shared labour ever did. Others think that's romanticising hardship, Lying here, listening to familiar breathing, you don't care which interpretation wins. Even pets become part of this equation. Dogs curl at feet or wedge themselves between bodies, adding their own heat and heartbeat to the pile. There are accounts of dogs saving lives this way, though it's hard to separate fact from folklore. What's certain is that animals were often allowed privileges during storms that would never be tolerated in summer. Cleanliness gives way to survival quickly. Sleep when it comes is uneven but surprisingly deep. Your body relaxes into the warmth around you. Muscles unclench. Fingers thaw. For the first time in days, you don't feel like you're fighting the cold alone. That changes everything. You dream of crowds, of shared spaces, of being held upright by the presence of others. When you wake briefly, disoriented, the press of bodies grounds you. You know exactly where you are. You know you're not exposed. Morning will bring stiffness, awkward apologies, maybe a joke or two once daylight makes the closeness feel strange again. But for now, in the heart of the blizzard, this is how settlers slept. Stacked together like supplies, like kindling, like proof that isolation was a luxury no one could afford. You close your eyes again, letting the combined warmth do its quiet work, trusting that if danger comes in the night, someone, maybe even you, will wake in time. Even packed together, wrapped in layers and shared breath, you don't sleep deeply enough to forget the storm entirely. Part of you stays alert, tuned to the sounds outside the walls. Listening becomes a form of watchfulness, something you do even while dreaming. During deadly blizzards, settlers learned that noise, or the sudden absence of it, was information. The wind has a language. You know its moods now. A rising howl means pressure building, snow lifting and scouring the ground. A rattling, uneven thump against the wall suggests drifting, snow piling where it shouldn't. And then there's the worst sound of all, a low, steady moan that doesn't change. That means the storm has settled in. It's not passing through, it's staying. You lie there, eyes closed, cataloguing these sounds without consciously trying. This habit shows up in multiple settler accounts. People describing storms, almost musically, noting pitch and rhythm. Historians debate whether this was genuine attentiveness, or something memory sharpened after the fact. Either way, you understand it. When sight is useless, sound is your only map. Inside the cabin, the building answers the storm. Wood pops and creaks as temperatures shift. Nails complain softly. The roof groans under weight that you can only imagine. Each sound has its own meaning, learned over long nights like this one. A sharp crack might just be contracting wood, or it might be a support giving way. You don't jump at every noise anymore, but you never fully relax. Sleep fractures around these sounds. You drift, then surface, then drift again. Sometimes you wake convinced something is wrong, only to realise it's just the storm doing what storms do. Other times, the alarm is real. A sudden thud against the wall. Snow sliding hard and fast from the roof. A shift in the wind that makes the cabin feel briefly exposed. In those moments, someone always stirs. No one panics. Panic is loud, wasteful. Instead, there's a quiet exchange. Someone sits up, listens harder, maybe stands to check the stove, or press a hand against the wall to feel for vibration. This half-awake problem-solving is one of the strangest aspects of frontier sleep. You're not fully conscious, but you're functional. Scholars still argue about how people manage this consistently under exhaustion. The best guess is necessity rewired priorities. Sleep adapted because it had to. There's also the fear of what you can't hear. Carbon monoxide is silent. So is extreme cold once it numbs you enough. Some settlers train themselves to wake at intervals, even without clocks, checking breath, checking the fire, checking each other. This wasn't exact. Sometimes you slept too long. Sometimes you woke too often. Both had consequences. The balance was imperfect and unforgiving. At some point in the night, the wind begins to change again. Not louder, not softer, different. It shifts direction, finding new weaknesses in the cabin. Snow that was packed tight against one wall loosens and slides. A window rattles where it didn't before. You sense this change before you fully register it. Your body tightens, ready to move. You sit up, disturbing the careful arrangement of bodies. Someone mutters. A child shifts closer to the warmth. You listen, heart steady but alert. After a few long seconds, nothing catastrophic happens. The cabin holds. The storm moves on to testing something else. You lie back down, but sleep doesn't come immediately. Your mind stays half engaged, replaying the sounds, imagining outcomes. This mental rehearsal is another quiet survival tool. Settlers rarely wrote about fear directly, but they wrote about anticipation, what they listened for, what they expected. Historians argue that this constant anticipation shaped frontier psychology, creating people who were calm in crisis but restless in peace. Eventually, fatigue pulls you under again. Not because the danger is past, but because your body can only stay alert for so long. This surrender isn't weakness, it's biology. You trust that the sounds will wake you if they need to, and most of the time, they do. As the night grinds on, the storm's voice fades slightly, then returns, then fades again. You learn to ride these waves, sleeping between them, surfacing when the noise sharpens. This is how you make it through, a partnership between instinct, environment, and just enough rest to keep going. When morning finally approaches, you'll realize you remember the storm more clearly than you remember your dreams. That's normal. Out here, the night listens back. By the time the night reaches its deepest point, warmth and danger have become inseparable. You know this now, even if you don't have words for it. The same fire that keeps your blood moving can quietly steal the breath from your lungs. During deadly blizzards, this invisible threat follows you into sleep, patient and undramatic. Carbon monoxide isn't understood scientifically yet, but its effects are familiar in a folk knowledge kind of way. People talk about bad air, about rooms that feel heavy, about waking with pounding headaches or not waking at all. Settlers learn to fear stillness indoors almost as much as the wind outside. A perfectly sealed cabin might keep out the cold, but it could also trap death. So you balance. Everything about sleep tonight is balance. The stove is kept low, never roaring. The damper is adjusted again and again, tiny movements that feel ritualistic. You crack a door or window just enough to let air move, stuffing the gap with cloth to blunt the cold. This seems contradictory, letting winter in on purpose, but you've seen what happens when you don't. You lie back down, aware of the air as much as the temperature. You breathe slowly, noticing whether it feels sharp or stale. This sensitivity isn't imagined. Settlers often described air quality in emotional terms: close, sour, wrong. Historians debate whether these descriptions reflect real physiological reactions or anxiety shaped by past tragedies. From inside the cabin, the distinction doesn't matter. If the air feels wrong, you change something. Sleep under these conditions is lighter than ever. You drift, but not far. Dreams feel shallow, easily punctured by consciousness. At times you wake with a strange clarity, heart steady, mind alert, as if some part of you refuses to go fully under. This half-sleep is exhausting, but it's also protective. You listen for breathing around you, not just sound, but rhythm. A pause that's too long, a pattern that's changed. Families learn these rhythms intimately, especially during storms. There are quiet accounts of people being shaken awake because someone noticed their breathing slow too much. Whether every such moment was truly dangerous is debated, but enough lives were saved that the habit stuck. Your own body sends signals too, a dull ache behind the eyes, a sudden wave of warmth that feels out of place, excessive sleepiness. These are warnings, though you might not label them as such. You sit up when you feel them, even if it means breaking the fragile comfort you've built. Sitting up brings fresher air. Movement keeps you conscious. There's a fringe but persistent belief among settlers that sleeping too close to the stove was unlucky. Not dangerous, unlucky. Folklore has a way of encoding practical advice into superstition. Historians argue that this kind of belief system helped people remember safety rules without needing explanations. You just know not to do it, and that's enough. At some point you switch places with someone else. Rotations aren't formal, but they happen. One person stays more awake while another sinks deeper into rest. The sharing of risk is quiet and unspoken. No one announces it. You just feel when it's your turn to be more alert. The storm outside continues, but it's no longer the only threat. Inside, the air itself demands respect. You treat sleep cautiously, like crossing thin ice. Necessary, unavoidable, but never without attention. Eventually the fire burns lower and the danger shifts again. Cold creeps back in, trading one risk for another. You pull blankets tighter, layers pressing close, and allow yourself to sleep a little more deeply now that the air feels cleaner. Morning will come, and with it, the chance to breathe freely again. For now, you exist in this careful equilibrium, drifting between warmth and wakefulness, knowing that surviving the blizzard means surviving your own shelter too. By the 10th stretch of this storm cycle, or what feels like the 10th, because time has stopped behaving normally, you realise that blizzards don't just trap bodies, they trap days. Sleep becomes unmoored from sunrise and sunset, floating instead between hunger, cold, and exhaustion. When settlers wrote about being snowed in, they often mention losing track of time entirely. You understand why. Inside the cabin, light barely changes. Snow has sealed the windows, turning them into dull, glowing panels. The world outside might as well not exist. This is when sleep turns strange. You nap in fragments, waking to eat, waking to tend the fire, waking because someone shifted beside you. Then you sleep again. Night and day blur into a continuous vigil punctuated by unconsciousness. There's a historical fact that stands out here. During severe winters, some settlers reported sleeping up to 14 or 15 hours a day, but never all at once. Sleep came in chunks, scattered across the 24 hours. Historians debate whether this was true sleep or something closer to torpor, a semi-hibernation brought on by cold, darkness, and limited food. From the inside, it just feels like your body conserving itself. You notice your dreams growing vivid, then dull, then absent altogether. Sometimes you wake unsure whether you've slept at all. This disorientation can be dangerous. People made mistakes when they didn't know how long they'd been awake. They overexerted. They misjudged daylight. A few wandered outside at the wrong time, convinced it was morning when it wasn't. Those stories end badly. To counter this, settlers invented markers. Meals, however small, became time anchors. Fire-tending cycles served the same purpose. Some people scratched marks on walls or boards to count wake periods. There's debate among scholars about how widespread these practices were, but they appear often enough in journals to suggest they weren't rare. You participate in this without thinking. You eat, then rest. You feed the fire, then lie down. You don't fight the rhythm anymore. Fighting wastes energy. Acceptance, in this case, is adaptive. Sleep itself changes quality. It's heavier after eating, lighter when you're hungry. Cold seeps into your dreams, shaping them into endless walks through snow or futile searches for shelter. These aren't nightmares exactly. They're rehearsals, your mind practicing scenarios it hopes never to face. There's also boredom, a word settlers didn't use much but clearly felt. With nowhere to go and little to do, the mind circles itself. Sleep becomes an escape as much as a necessity. You lie down not because you're tired, but because there's nothing else to spend energy on. This pattern worries some modern historians who see in it early signs of seasonal affective stress. Others caution against applying modern psychology too freely. Out here, labels don't matter. Getting through does. When you wake during one of these long, indistinct periods, the cabin feels almost warm. Not comfortable, but tolerable. The storm has insulated you completely now. Snow presses on all sides, muting sound, sealing cracks. It's dangerous if it collapses. It's protective if it holds. This duality defines everything about blizzard sleep. You shift, adjust layers, check fingers and toes again. The routine grounds you. Even without clocks or daylight, these repeated actions create a sense of continuity. You're still here. Time is still moving, even if you can't see it. Eventually there's a subtle change. The air feels lighter. The silence deepens. You don't know yet whether this means the storm has ended or simply paused. You sleep again, because that's what you do now. Sleep isn't a break from being snowed in. It's how you remain snowed in without breaking. When children are part of this sealed, snowbound world, sleep becomes something you manage for them as much as for yourself. You're tired in ways you didn't know existed, but their sleep matters differently. Adults can endure fear quietly. Children can't, not for long. During blizzards, keeping them asleep isn't about rest. It's about keeping panic from spreading. You arrange them carefully before the night settles in. The warmest spot, the centre of the group, furthest from walls and doors. Smaller bodies lose heat faster, and settlers knew this long before they could explain it. It shows up in journals as simple statements. We kept the children between us and never elaborated because no elaboration was needed. Bedtime routines don't disappear during storms, they compress. A story told in a low voice, a prayer repeated from memory, a song hummed instead of sung. These familiar patterns anchor children to something predictable when everything else has gone wrong. Historians debate whether such routines truly reduced fear or simply gave adults something to focus on. Watching a child's breathing slow, you're confident it helped. Children sleep more deeply than the adults at first. Exhaustion takes them quickly. That's a blessing and a risk. Their bodies are resilient, but they're also less aware of danger signals. You check them constantly. Hands, cheeks, feet. Too cold, too still, too warm. Overheating under too many layers was a real concern even in winter. Sweat leads to dampness. Dampness leads to cold. The balance is delicate. There are grim historical accounts of children who fell asleep during storms and never woke up. They're usually mentioned briefly, without detail, as if detail would make them unbearable. Scholars argue about the causes: hypothermia, carbon monoxide, illness worsened by cold, but the effect on survivors is clear. It made adults hyper-vigilant, sometimes to the point of exhaustion. So you wake them occasionally, gently, a whispered name, a hand on the shoulder, not enough to frighten them, just enough to make sure they stir. This practice shows up in multiple frontier narratives. Whether it actually prevented tragedy or simply provided reassurance is debated, but it became part of storm nights regardless. Children also react to sound differently. The wind frightens them more than the cold. You notice how their sleep twitches when the cabin groans or snow slams against the walls. You pull them closer, offer murmured explanations that are more tone than content. It's all right. The house is strong. Whether you believe it fully or not doesn't matter. They do. At some point, one of them wakes fully, eyes wide in the dim light. You hold them until their breathing slows again. This closeness cost you sleep, but you don't resent it. Settlers wrote surprisingly little about resentment during these times. Modern readers sometimes expect it. Instead, the writing suggests a narrowing of focus so complete that only immediate needs existed. As the night drags on, you notice something else. Children adapt quickly. After a few storm nights, they sleep through noises that once startled them. Their bodies learn the rhythm, just like yours. This adaptability is both comforting and unsettling. It means they'll survive. It also means this kind of night is becoming normal. By morning, if you can call it that, you count heads before anything else. It's an instinctive ritual, everyone accounted for. Only then do you allow yourself to feel tired. Sleep during blizzards isn't equal for everyone. Adults sacrifice depth so children can have it. That trade, repeated across countless cabins, is part of how families made it through winters that erased others entirely. You lie back down when you can, letting exhaustion pull you under, knowing that the next time you wake, you'll check them all again, and again, until the storm loosens its grip. There's a moment in every prolonged blizzard when the line between indoors and outdoors dissolves. The storm pushes so hard against your small world that it forces its way inside, not just as cold air, but as living creatures. This is when animals stop being property or background noise and become part of the sleep equation. You hear them first, a restless shift in the attached shed, hooves stamping, a low, anxious sound that carries through wood and snow. Livestock hate storms more than people do. They don't understand walls or plans. They just know the air hurts and the ground has vanished. Leaving them outside now would mean losing them by morning, so you bring them in, or as close as you can. Chickens in crates, a goat tied near the stove, sometimes even a calf, steaming gently in the cold, eyes wide and confused. This wasn't common in good weather, but during deadly blizzards rules bent fast. Cleanliness, smell, and order gave way to heat and survival. There's a documented historical practice of building cabins with adjoining animal spaces for exactly this reason. Body heat mattered. A cow gives off more warmth than a fire that's allowed to burn low. Historians still debate how much this actually raised indoor temperatures, but settlers believed in it strongly enough to redesign homes around the idea. Belief, again, shapes behaviour. Sleeping with animals changes the night. The air smells stronger. Hay, dung, wet fur. Breathing becomes louder, more layered. You feel vibrations through the floor as something shifts its weight. At first, this makes sleep harder. Your senses stay alert, cataloguing unfamiliar sounds. But gradually, the warmth compensates. Animals radiate heat constantly. It's different from fire heat, less sharp, more even. You notice cold drafts weaken. Frost patterns retreat slightly. The cabin feels less like a box in the wind and more like a shared shelter. This is especially true if the storm lasts days. Over time, the combined warmth of people and animals creates a fragile equilibrium. There's a fringe detail settlers sometimes mentioned. Animals sleeping during storms often fell into deeper, calmer rest once indoors, and their steady breathing helped people relax. Whether this was real or just comforting interpretation is debated, but lying there, listening to the slow rhythm of a large animal. Nearby, you understand why it mattered. Life recognizes life. You're careful, though. Animals are unpredictable when stressed. You tie them securely, leave space, keep children clear. Sleep is lighter tonight because of that. You wake at sudden movements, a startled kick, a loud snort. But you'd rather wake than freeze. In some accounts, dogs become heroes during these nights, curling against people, alerting them to danger, even waking families when fires went wrong. It's hard to separate truth from story here, but dogs were almost always mentioned by name. That detail alone tells you how important they were. By morning, if it comes, everyone is stiff, sore, and deeply uncomfortable. The cabin looks and smells nothing like a home, but everyone is alive. The animals are alive too. That matters. Losing livestock in winter often meant not surviving the rest of it. You lie down again once the worst has passed, sharing space with creatures you normally keep at a distance. During blizzards in the Old West, sleep wasn't solitary or clean or dignified. It was crowded with breath and warmth and necessity, and sometimes that was exactly what saved you. As the nights pile up, another truth settles in. Sleep itself can hurt you. Not immediately, not dramatically, but slowly, quietly, while you're doing everything right. Frostbite doesn't always strike in the open. Sometimes it waits until you're still. You wake with a strange numbness, usually in places you didn't protect well enough. Toes, fingers, the tip of your nose, ears. At first, it doesn't feel painful. That's what makes it dangerous. The skin feels waxy, distant, like it belongs to someone else. Settlers describe this sensation in blunt terms: dead feeling, wooden. They didn't know the mechanism, only the outcome. You sit up immediately when you notice it. Movement brings blood back, and blood brings pain. Sharp, burning pain. It's unpleasant, but it's also reassuring. Pain means tissue is still alive. There's a long-standing debate among historians about what settlers did next. Some rubbed the area gently, others vigorously. Some used snow, believing cold should counter cold. We now know that caused more damage, but back then, it was common advice. Survival knowledge was incomplete and sometimes wrong. You're careful not to fall back asleep too quickly. That's another danger. Letting numbness persist through deep sleep can cost you parts of yourself. There are accounts, quiet, almost casual, of people losing toes and fingers over winter mentioned the way one might mention losing a tool. It was tragic, but also normalized. Life went on around missing pieces. You adjust your layers before lying down again. Extra socks, a scarf pulled higher, a hat pressed lower. You tuck vulnerable areas closer to your core. These small changes make the next stretch of sleep safer. Not safe. Safer. This constant recalibration is exhausting. Sleep becomes something you manage actively, not something that happens to you. Settlers didn't talk about sleep quality. They talked about waking up intact. That was the metric. You also notice how stillness itself feels dangerous now. You shift more often, even when tired. Micro movements, wiggling toes, flexing fingers, become part of your half sleep. This habit shows up in multiple accounts, described indirectly as restless nights. Historians debate whether this restlessness was psychological or physiological. Lying here, you know it's both. There's also the fear of the face. Breath freezes on eyelashes, stiffens eyebrows. You wake to find your hair rimed with frost from condensation. It's beautiful in a distant way. It's also a warning. You pull fabric over your mouth and nose, creating a warm pocket of air to breathe. This helps, but it also increases moisture. Balance, again. Children are especially vulnerable to frostbite during sleep, and you're hyper-aware of this now. You check them constantly, even more than before. Their skin recovers faster, but damage can still happen. The responsibility weighs on you, heavy as the blankets. By morning, the numbness has faded into soreness. Redness blooms where blood has returned. You count yourself lucky. This time, you caught it. Others didn't. Settlers who survived winters often carried these small injuries as permanent reminders. Crooked fingers, shortened toes, scarred ears. Survival left marks. You lie back down later when you can, and sleep again despite the risk. You have to. There's no alternative. During deadly blizzards, settlers accepted that sleep could injure them, just as work could. Both were necessary. Both carried risk. You learn to navigate that risk night after night, adjusting, enduring, and hoping the next numbness would fade instead of staying. By now, sleep has become a shared responsibility. Not just shared space or shared warmth, but shared vigilance. During the worst blizzards, settlers learned that everyone sleeping at once was dangerous. Someone needed to stay closer to awake, even if no one officially said so. You fall into this pattern without ceremony. One person rests more deeply, while another drifts lightly, half listening, half dreaming. After a while, the roles reverse. No clock marks the change. It happens by feel. Fatigue shifting, alertness returning just enough. Historians sometimes call this informal watch, and they debate whether it was intentional planning or something that emerged naturally. From the inside, it feels inevitable. Tonight, it's you who stays closer to the surface. You lie still, eyes closed, but your mind remains engaged. You track the fire's behaviour by sound. You note the rhythm of breathing around you. You listen to the wind for changes that might signal trouble. This isn't stressful anymore, it's almost meditative. Purpose steadies you. Sleep, in this state, is different. You dip into it briefly, then rise back out. These micro-sleeps are shallow, but restorative in their own way. Modern researchers might compare them to survival sleep patterns seen in extreme conditions. Settlers, of course, had no such framework. They just knew it worked well enough. You notice that when you're in this role, fear recedes. There's no space for it. Fear requires imagination, and imagination is busy with monitoring. This is another quiet psychological adaptation. Historians argue that this constant low-level vigilance shaped frontier personalities, making people calm under pressure but uneasy in stillness. You can feel that shift happening. At some point you reach over and add a small piece of wood to the fire, just enough to keep embers alive. You don't wake anyone else. This small act feels significant, like turning the earth a fraction on its axis. Warmth spreads subtly. Breathing deepens around you. Someone sighs in their sleep. Later, you switch. You let yourself sink deeper while someone else becomes the listener. You trust them because you have to. This trust is built quickly in crisis. It doesn't need years. It needs proof, and everyone here has proven themselves simply by staying. There's a fringe detail settlers sometimes mentioned. People who took watch roles often reported dreaming less, or not at all. Sleep became blank, functional. Scholars debate whether this was real or just unremembered dreams. Either way, it reinforced the sense that sleep was no longer personal. It belonged to the group. The storm continues its slow grind outside. Inside, the night is broken into manageable pieces by this rotation. No one is fully rested. No one is fully exhausted. That balance keeps you alive. As your turn to watch fades and you slip into deeper rest, you feel a rare thing. Confidence. Not that everything will be fine, but that you've learned how to handle it if it isn't. Sleep, shared and guarded, becomes another tool in your survival kit. By morning, when it comes, no one will remember exactly who slept when. It won't matter. What matters is that someone was always listening. When the body is pushed this far, the mind has to step in and help. Sleep doesn't come easily anymore, not even in fragments. So you learn tricks, quiet ones, passed along without instruction manuals or names. Mental habits that smooth the edge of fear just enough for rest to slip in. Prayer is the most common, but not always in the way you'd expect. It isn't always pleading or dramatic. Often it's repetitive, almost mechanical. Familiar words spoken in the same order every night. The content matters less than the rhythm. Rhythm slows the breath. Slow breath invites sleep. Historians debate whether prayer helped because of belief or because of structure. From where you lie, wrapped in wool and fatigue, that distinction feels academic. Others count. Heartbeats, breaths, the seconds between wind gusts. You catch yourself doing this without realizing it. Your mind latching onto patterns. Pattern means predictability, and predictability feels like safety. Even false patterns are better than chaos. Storytelling emerges too, not out loud usually, in your head. You replay familiar memories, retell old stories, imagine walking through known places. Some settlers described mentally walking the same path every night. A road from childhood, a route through town, a riverbank. Scholars see this as a grounding technique, a way to anchor the mind when the present is too hostile. You just know it works. There's also deliberate distraction. You think about practical things you'll do when the storm ends. Repairs, chores, meals. Planning gives the future weight, makes it feel inevitable. This forward focus appears often in survival narratives, though historians disagree on whether it was conscious optimism or simply habit. Either way, it nudges sleep closer. You notice that fear peaks when your thoughts wander, so you don't let them. You gently herd them back to safer territory. The act of doing this is calming in itself. Control, even partial, eases the nervous system. Settlers wouldn't have phrased it like that, but their behaviour shows they understood it intuitively. Children benefit from these tricks too. You hum softly, barely audible, the same tune every night. Not to entertain, but to signal normalcy. The tune doesn't matter. Consistency does. Children fall asleep faster when nothing seems new. At some point, the tricks fade into the background as sleep finally takes hold. It's lighter than it once was, but it's real. You drift with less resistance, carried by repetition and routine rather than comfort. Dreams, when they come, are gentler now, less frantic. They loop familiar images instead of inventing new dangers. This is another debated point among historians, whether people under prolonged stress experience dream adaptation. You can't analyse it. You just notice the relief. You wake briefly, reposition, repeat the process. Breath. Count. Remember. Plan. Drift. Sleep becomes a skill, something you practice rather than expect. And like any skill, you get better at it with repetition. By the time the storm loosens its grip, these mental habits are ingrained. They don't disappear when danger does. Many settlers carried them into peaceful times, finding silence harder than wind, stillness stranger than vigilance. Sleep had changed them. Lying here, eyes closed, you don't think about that yet. You're just grateful the tricks still work, that the mind can be trained to soften when the world refuses to. Some storms refuse to stay personal. They grow so large, so destructive, that they stop being weather and become reference points. Long after they pass, people will say before and after them. As you lie down during this one, you don't know yet whether it will earn a name, but you can feel its weight pressing into memory already. The old West had blizzards that rewrote rules. The winter of 1886-87, later called the Big Die-Up, killed hundreds of thousands of cattle and countless settlers across the plains. Another, the schoolhouse blizzard of 1888, struck so suddenly that children were dismissed into clear skies and died in whiteouts minutes later. These storms didn't just kill in daylight. They haunted nights. Survivors wrote about sleeping differently forever afterward, even in mild weather. Historians still debate whether these accounts reflect trauma or hard-earned wisdom. From where you are, the difference feels thin. Tonight, sleep comes with memory layered into it. Not your own memories yet, but inherited ones. Warnings passed along by neighbours, stories told in low voices during winter evenings. You think about people who slept through storms like this and didn't wake. The thought doesn't paralyse you. It sharpens you. You adjust your bedding again, even though it's already arranged. You check the fire, even though you checked it minutes ago. This isn't anxiety, it's calibration. Legendary storms taught settlers that small oversights mattered more when conditions were extreme. Surviving an ordinary blizzard didn't guarantee survival in an extraordinary one. Outside, the wind surges with renewed purpose. It's not random now. It feels organised, almost deliberate, as if the storm has found its rhythm. Snow strikes the cabin in waves. You listen for familiar cues, comparing this storm's voice to others you've heard described. Louder doesn't always mean worse. Faster doesn't always mean deadlier. Cold combined with stillness. That's what people feared most. Sleep, when it comes, is threaded with vigilance. You dream of storms within storms, layers of white and dark folding over each other. You wake with your heart steady but alert, ready to respond. This pattern, dream, wake, assess, rest, repeats through the night. There's a strange comfort in knowing this storm may be remembered. If it spares you, it will give you a story that carries weight. Stories were survival tools too. They warned others. They taught lessons without instruction. Settlers who lived through famous blizzards often became informal authorities on winter, their advice listened to with particular respect. Historians argue about how accurate these storm memories were. Trauma reshapes recollection. Details blur or sharpen selectively. But the behaviours those memories inspired, better preparation, different sleep habits, earlier caution, saved lives. Accuracy mattered less than impact. As you lie there, breathing slow, you don't try to imagine telling this story someday. You focus on making it to morning. Legendary storms aren't legendary while you're inside them. They're just loud, cold, and relentless. Sleep comes anyway, because it must. Even history sleeps briefly before it's written. Not all the knowledge keeping you alive tonight was learned. Here, much of it travelled with people, folded into trunks and memories long before the wagons rolled west. As you settle in to sleep again, you're relying on instincts shaped by winters in other places, Scandinavia, the Alps, the British Isles, Eastern Europe. The frontier didn't invent winter survival, it inherited it. Immigrants brought habits that looked odd at first and brilliant later. Sleeping with head coverings, ventilating even in extreme cold, eating heavy meals before bed during storms. These practices appear in settler communities tied to specific regions, and historians have traced patterns linking survival rates to cultural background. It's debated how strong these correlations are, but the influence is unmistakable. You pull your hat lower without thinking the way your parents did. You leave a small gap near the roofline, remembering warnings about trapped air. These aren't choices you analyse, they're reflexes, passed down and reinforced by nights like this. Some settlers built sleeping platforms along interior walls, raised off the floor and away from drafts. This design appears frequently in communities with Eastern European roots. Others favoured heavy wool bedding and shared sleeping arrangements, echoing practices from colder parts of Europe. Out here, methods mixed and adapted. The land didn't care where your ideas came from, only whether they worked. There's scholarly debate about whether the Old West represented a break from Old World traditions, or a continuation under harsher conditions. Lying here, you feel the continuity more than the break. You're doing what people have always done in winter, layering, clustering, listening, waiting. Even mental habits have roots. Counting prayers, reciting psalms, telling familiar stories. These are older than the frontier. They travelled across oceans because they were portable and effective. Sleep has always needed help when the world turns hostile. As the wind presses on, you think briefly about those who didn't have this inherited knowledge. People new to winter climates suffered disproportionately. There are tragic accounts of settlers from warmer regions who underestimated cold nights, slept improperly, and paid for it. Historians argue that these stories became cautionary tales, shaping community norms through fear as much as instruction. You adjust again, pulling blankets just so, aligning layers the way you were taught. It feels grounding to know this isn't improvisation. It's participation in something older than you. Sleep comes with a sense of lineage now. You're not just enduring the night, you're reenacting a survival script refined over generations. That thought is oddly comforting. It makes the storm feel less personal, less targeted. When you wake briefly, you check the same things people have always checked. Breath, warmth, sound. The tools are simple. They always were. The frontier may have been new, but winter wasn't. And as you drift off again, you're grateful for the knowledge that arrived before you did. Sometimes, despite all planning and inherited wisdom, the cabin fails you. Not catastrophically at first, just enough to force a decision. A wall bows too much. A roof leaks snow steadily. The wind finds a seam and worries it open. This is when sleep becomes something you do elsewhere, because staying put is no longer the safest option. You don't rush. Panic makes bad shelters. You assess, even as the storm rages. Wagons become temporary homes, their curved tops shedding wind better than flat roofs. Dugouts, half underground, roofed with sod and timber, offer a different kind of protection. Snow caves are last resorts, but they exist in the mental catalogue of options. Settlers learned these alternatives not from manuals, but from watching what survived when cabins didn't. Sleeping in a wagon is cramped and miserable, but it has advantages. You pile in together, using supplies as insulation. Grain sacks, clothing, spare canvas, everything becomes padding. The curved shape deflects wind, and snow piles harmlessly around it instead of pressing in. There are accounts of entire families sleeping upright in wagons for nights at a time, taking turns slumping and waking. Historians debate how common this was, but enough stories align that it clearly happened. Dugouts feel different. The earth holds steady. Wind passes overhead instead of through walls. Inside, the air is damp but comparatively still. You sleep lower, closer to the ground, but also more protected from gusts. Some settlers preferred dugouts in winter despite their reputation for discomfort. Scholars argue whether this preference was practical or psychological. Earth feels safer than wood when storms rage. Lying here, you understand both arguments. Snow shelters are the most extreme option. You only attempt them if there's no alternative. Snow is cut and packed, shaped into a crude dome or trench roof. Inside, it's shockingly quiet. Snow absorbs sound completely. The silence is unnerving at first, but it also signals protection. Temperatures inside can be far warmer than outside. Sleeping here requires discipline, ventilation holes, careful positioning, constant awareness. There's debate about how often settlers use such shelters, versus how often these stories come from indigenous survival techniques adapted in emergencies. Either way, the knowledge existed. Sleep in these places is lighter, more alert. You're aware that the shelter is temporary, that collapse is possible. You wake often to check walls, clear vents, adjust positions. But you sleep anyway, because the alternative is exposure. There's a strange humility in abandoning a cabin. It's an admission that preparation wasn't enough. Settlers didn't write about this easily. Cabins symbolised permanence. Leaving one in a storm felt like failure, even if it saved your life. Historians point out that pride likely killed people who stayed put too long. Survival sometimes meant letting go of what you built. When you finally rest in this new place, pressed against earth or canvas or packed snow, you feel smaller. The storm feels larger, but the balance has shifted back towards safety, just enough. You close your eyes, listening to a muted version of the wind, trusting that this improvised shelter will hold long enough. Sleep here is an act of flexibility, and flexibility, more than strength, is what keeps you alive tonight. When the wind finally loosens its grip, it does so without ceremony. There's no announcement, no clear ending. You notice it in absence first. The constant pressure on the walls fades. The screaming edge of sound softens into something like a sigh. You wake not because something is wrong, but because something is different. Silence after a blizzard isn't peaceful at first. It's heavy. It presses on your ears until you're sure you're missing something important. Settlers wrote about this moment with unease, describing it as unnatural or too still. Historians debate whether this reaction was psychological, adrenaline suddenly without an outlet, or whether the acoustics of snow-covered landscapes genuinely disoriented people. Standing here, half awake, you don't care why it feels wrong. You just know it does. You lie still, listening harder than ever. No wind, no creaking walls, just breathing. your own and others. You count them instinctively. Everyone is still here. That knowledge settles you more than the silence ever could. Eventually you sit up. The air feels clearer now, sharper but cleaner. That's another sign. Storm air carries moisture, pressure, movement. This air is static, cold, crystalline. Your breath hangs and falls straight down instead of drifting sideways. The blizzard has moved on, leaving its work behind. You don't rush outside. Settlers learned that the quiet after storms could be just as dangerous as the storm itself. Snow bridges hide drifts. Roofs overloaded with weight can collapse once wind support disappears. You wait. Caution lingers longer than fear. Sleep, oddly, feels heavier now. Your body senses the shift and wants to recover what it lost. This is when people overslept, when watches failed, when frostbite crept in unnoticed because vigilance relaxed too fast. There's scholarly debate about how many post-blizzard injuries occurred during this exact window. Enough accounts exist to make you careful. You lie back down, letting yourself rest again, but with boundaries. You adjust layers one more time. You reposition closer to others. You set a mental marker. Wake again soon, even if nothing calls you. This final stretch of storm sleep is the most deceptive. It feels earned. It feels safe. It isn't entirely. Dreams return now, fuller and stranger. You dream of open space, of sound rushing back in all at once. You wake with a start, heart pounding, then realise the silence is still there. The world hasn't ended. It's just holding its breath. When light finally pushes through snow-covered windows, it's blinding. Reflected white floods the cabin, turning shadows sharp and unfamiliar. This is morning, unmistakably. You sit up fully now, muscles aching, skin tight with cold and dryness. You're alive. Everyone else is too. The silence remains as you prepare to face what the storm left behind. You understand now why settlers remembered this moment so clearly. Not the worst of the blizzard, but the quiet after. Sleep carried you to this edge. Waking carries you forward. When you finally rise for good, it feels like dragging yourself out of deep water. Every movement is slow, deliberate. Sleep did its job just enough to keep you alive, but it didn't heal you. Not yet. That will take time the storm didn't allow. Your first full task is digging out. This begins almost immediately after waking because daylight, real daylight, is a resource. You don't know how long it will last before weather turns again. You eat something quickly, barely tasting it, then step into the blinding white. The world outside is unrecognizable. Landmarks are gone, fences are raised, wagons buried up to their axles or deeper. The snow isn't soft. Wind has packed it into layers, some brittle, some dense as sand. Digging is exhausting, especially after nights of broken sleep. People who pushed too hard here sometimes collapsed. Settlers learned to pace themselves, though not always successfully. Sleep deprivation shows itself now. You misjudge distances. You lose tools momentarily and panic until you find them inches away. These cognitive slips are well documented in post-storm accounts, though settlers didn't call them that. They just wrote about stupidity or clumsiness, blaming themselves rather than the conditions. Historians now see these moments as evidence of how thin the margin really was. You clear the door first, then windows, then the roof if you can reach it safely. Clearing roofs was dangerous but necessary. The weight of snow could crush a cabin days after a storm ended. Sleep at night didn't end the risk, it just postponed it. As you work, you feel sleep tug at you again. Not just tiredness, but a heavy pull behind the eyes, a desire to sit down just for a moment. This is when people died, even after surviving the blizzard itself. Falling asleep outside, even briefly, was often fatal. You recognize the danger and force yourself to stay moving, to keep circulation active. If neighbours are nearby, you check on them as soon as you can. This was a common practice, born of bitter experience. People who seemed fine the night before were sometimes found frozen in beds, victims of bad air, cold, or sheer exhaustion. These discoveries haunted survivors for years. Sleep, once comforting, became suspect. When you return indoors, you collapse onto your bed or pallet, fully clothed. This sleep is different. It's deep, heavy, unguarded. The storm is over, and your body knows it. You sleep longer than you intended. When you wake, light has shifted again. Time has passed without you tracking it. This post-storm sleep is both necessary and risky. Settlers learned to allow it in measured doses, waking each other if it stretched too long. Recovery had to be managed as carefully as survival. As evening approaches, you prepare for another night. Not as severe maybe, but winter hasn't loosened its hold yet. You've learned too much to be careless now. You'll sleep again because you must, but you'll never sleep the same way you did before the storm. The hardest awakenings come after you've survived. Not during the storm, not in the coldest hours of the night, but in the quiet mornings that follow, when you step outside and realise someone else didn't. You notice the signs before you see the bodies. A cabin that never opens its door. Smoke that doesn't rise. Tracks that end abruptly in the snow. These details tighten your chest long before confirmation arrives. Sleep carried you through the blizzard. It didn't carry everyone. When you finally enter a neighbour's cabin, the cold hits differently. Not sharper, emptier. The fire is long dead. The air smells stale, untouched by breath. You find them in bed, fully dressed, just like you were. Blankets pulled up. Faces calm. It's unsettling how peaceful it looks. Settlers wrote about this again and again. The absence of struggle. Death in sleep left no mess, no drama. That made it harder to understand, harder to accept. Historians debate causes in these cases. Carbon monoxide, hypothermia, illness compounded by exhaustion. Sometimes it's impossible to know. Survivors often blame themselves anyway. If only I'd checked, if only I'd woken them. These thoughts lodge deep and stay there. You don't linger. Cold doesn't respect grief. You do what needs doing, covering bodies, marking places, telling others when you can. Funerals wait for spring in some cases. Winter isn't sentimental. It demands practicality first. Sleep feels different after this. That night, when you lie down again, rest doesn't feel like refuge. It feels like a risk you're taking consciously. You're hyper-aware of every sensation. Warmth feels suspicious. Drowsiness feels like a trap. You fight sleep longer than you should just to prove you're still in control. This reaction shows up clearly in survivor accounts. People describe being afraid to sleep for days after a storm took someone nearby. Historians argue whether this fear was rational or trauma-driven. The distinction doesn't matter much when you're lying in the dark, listening to your own breathing to make sure it doesn't stop. Eventually exhaustion wins anyway. It always does. But your sleep is lighter now, edged with vigilance that doesn't fully fade even as the season turns. You wake often, checking the fire, checking the air, checking yourself. Community memory hardens around these losses. Names get attached to storms. Warnings gain urgency. Don't sleep with the stove closed. Don't lie too still. These phrases carry weight now, backed by faces you can't forget. When morning comes, you wake with relief mixed with guilt. You're still here. Others aren't. Sleep didn't choose fairly. It never did. But you'll keep lying down when night comes because survival requires it, even when rest feels earned at someone else's expense. After loss, habits change. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in small, stubborn ways that stick. You don't announce these changes. You just do things differently now. Sleep especially becomes more intentional, shaped by what you've seen and who didn't wake up. You prepare earlier in the evening. Fires are set lower but steadier. Ventilation gaps are checked twice. Bedding is arranged with more care, layers placed with memory guiding your hands. These adjustments feel quiet, almost invisible, but they matter. Settlers learned most effectively from tragedy. It's an uncomfortable truth, and historians still debate how much frontier knowledge came from observation versus loss. Standing here, you know the answer is both. You also change how you wake. You no longer trust sleep to end on its own. You set crude reminders, agreeing with someone to nudge you after a certain time, positioning yourself so cold, drafts force you to shift eventually, even sleeping lighter on purpose. Deep, unbroken sleep feels indulgent now, maybe even irresponsible. There's a quirky but documented habit that appears after harsh winters, people sleeping with one arm outside the blankets. The idea was that cold on the skin would wake you before anything worse could happen. Scholars debate whether this was widespread or just memorable because of how strange it sounds. You try it once, It works, but it's miserable. Still, misery beats not waking up. You talk about sleep more openly now. Advice is exchanged without pride. Try more layers underneath. Don't block the chimney too much. Wake the children once or twice. These conversations are practical, stripped of ego. Winter doesn't care how experienced you think you are. There's also a mental shift. You stop blaming people entirely for dying in their sleep. You've seen how thin the margin is, how a single choice, burning one more log, sealing one more crack, can tip the balance. This understanding brings a strange calm, less judgment, more caution. Sleep becomes something you respect, not trust. You don't romanticize it anymore. It's not rest, it's risk management. And yet, paradoxically, it becomes easier to lie down once you accept that. Fear fades when you replace it with process. You notice these habits spreading. Newer settlers adopt them quickly, often without knowing why. This is how frontier knowledge solidifies, not in books, but in behavior copied because it works. Historians sometimes call this practical tradition, rules that survive because ignoring them has visible consequences. When you close your eyes now, you do so with intention. You know where the fire is, you know where the air moves, you know who's near you. That awareness doesn't keep you awake, it allows you to sleep. Loss carved these lessons into you, but they're what carry you forward. When the next storm comes, and it will, you'll lie down wiser than before. Not invincible, just better prepared. Over time, the storms blur together, but the lessons don't. They settle into the community like sediment, layering year after year until they form something solid. You notice it in the way people talk about winter now, not with fear exactly, but with respect sharpened by memory. Sleep practices, once private and improvised, become shared knowledge. Stories are how this knowledge travels, not dramatic campfire tales, but quiet recollections offered when the wind picks up or the temperature drops too fast. During the winter of someone begins and everyone listens. The story always circles back to night, to how they slept or failed to what worked, to what didn't. Historians argue that these stories exaggerated danger over time. Maybe they did. But exaggeration keeps people cautious, and caution keeps people alive. You hear the same advice repeated in different voices. Don't sleep alone if you can help it. Don't trust a sealed room. Don't let exhaustion make decisions for you. These aren't rules written anywhere. They're carried in tone, in timing, in the way people glance at the stove before lying down. New settlers absorb this quickly. Winter teaches faster than any neighbour could. You see it in their eyes after the first bad storm, how they listen more carefully, ask fewer questions, imitate what others do. Community memory doesn't require belief, it requires survival. There's debate among scholars about how much this shared knowledge reduced winter deaths over time. Records are incomplete, but patterns suggest that settlements with strong oral traditions and mutual aid fared better than isolated homesteads. Lying down at night, knowing others nearby are following the same cautious rituals, you feel that difference. You're not just relying on your own judgment, you're leaning on a collective past. Sleep in this context becomes almost ceremonial. Fires are adjusted in similar ways across cabins. Bedding is arranged with familiar logic. People wake at similar intervals, even without coordination. It's not synchronized, but it rhymes. This quiet alignment is comforting. It makes the night feel less arbitrary. You contribute to this memory too, even without meaning to. Someone asks how you got through a particular storm and you answer simply, "We stayed dressed. We took turns waking. We kept the air moving." These statements lodge in someone else's mind. Next winter, they'll remember them at the moment it matters. There's a strange humility in this process. No one claims expertise for long. Winter humbles everyone eventually. The best you can do is pass on what you know and hope it's enough. Sleep becomes part of that inheritance. As you lie down tonight, the storm distant or maybe just gathering, you follow habits shaped by people who came before you and people you've lost. You don't think of them explicitly. You don't have to. Their influence is already in your hands, in the way you tuck blankets, in the way you listen before closing your eyes. This is how communities survive deadly blizzards, not just through walls and fires, but through memory embedded in sleep. Night after night, lesson after lesson, carried forward as quietly as breath in the dark. After enough winters like this, you realise something that would sound strange to anyone who hasn't lived it. Sleep itself becomes an act of defiance. Not dramatic defiance, not shouted or celebrated. Quiet defiance. The simple choice to lie down, close your eyes, and trust that you've done enough to wake up again. The land doesn't care whether you rest. The cold doesn't pause out of respect for exhaustion. And yet, you sleep anyway. You have to. Every blizzard tries to strip you down to reaction and panic. Sleep pushes back against that. It says you're still human, not just a bundle of reflexes clinging to heat. Settlers didn't frame it this way, of course. They talked about getting through the night or holding on till morning. But historians looking back often note how survival required more than constant vigilance. People who refused to sleep at all didn't last. They made mistakes. They broke down. Rest, however imperfect, was resistance against the storm's attempt to grind you down completely. You feel this most clearly on nights when fear would be justified. The wind rises again, rattling loose boards, reminding you that winter isn't finished. You could stay awake. You could sit by the fire and watch shadows crawl across the walls. But instead you choose to lie down. You arrange yourself carefully. Check the air, check the fire, check the people around you, and then you stop. That stopping is powerful. It conserves strength. It steadies the mind. It prepares you for whatever comes next. Sleep isn't surrender here. It's strategy. There's a fringe belief that circulated among some settlers, that going to sleep calmly during a storm improved your chances of survival, while panicked wakefulness invited misfortune. Scholars debate whether this was superstition or an early recognition of stress management. Either way, the belief itself shaped behaviour. People made themselves lie down, slow their breathing, quiet their thoughts. They slept because they believed it mattered. You notice how different this feels from the first nights you spent in fear. Then, sleep felt stolen. Now, it feels claimed. You've learned the rules well enough to trust them most of the time. Not blindly, never blindly, but enough. When morning comes after a night like this, you feel a small, private satisfaction. The storm didn't take that from you. You rested. You woke. That matters. As you lie there, drifting toward another cautious sleep, you understand something settlers rarely wrote outright. Every night survived was a refusal to disappear. Sleep was how you stayed present in a place that tried constantly to erase you. Eventually, almost without you noticing, winter begins to loosen its grip. Not dramatically, not all at once. It retreats the way it arrived, in increments so small you only recognise them in hindsight. A night where the cold doesn't bite quite as hard. A morning where the stove isn't completely dead when you wake. Sleep changes first. It always does. You find yourself staying asleep a little longer between checks. Dreams deepen. Your body shifts less often in the night. These are the earliest signs that the worst has passed, even if snow still blankets everything outside. Settlers often noted this change indirectly, writing that they rested better before mentioning any improvement in weather. Sleep was the canary in the coal mine of survival. The fear around sleeping fades slowly, cautiously. You never return to the careless rest you once knew, but vigilance softens into habit rather than tension. You still dress warmly at night. You still respect the stove. But you no longer lie there listening for death in every sound. Wind becomes just wind again. Spring doesn't arrive yet. That takes longer. But the long winter breaks, and with it, the cycle of deadly blizzards that taught you how to sleep in the first place. You wake one morning and realise you slept through the night without waking once. The realisation is startling, then quietly wonderful. Historians debate how much these winters shaped the identity of the Old West. Some argue that survival narratives are exaggerated. Others point to population loss, abandoned homesteads and weather records as evidence that the danger was very real. What no one disputes is that those who made it through carried winter with them forever. As you lie down now, on a calmer night, you still arrange yourself carefully. Old habits remain. But there's gratitude mixed in with caution. You've learned how to sleep when sleep was dangerous. That knowledge doesn't disappear when danger recedes. The storms will come again someday. Another winter, another night of wind and white darkness. But you'll meet it differently now. You'll lie down knowing what to listen for. what to trust and when to wake. For now, you rest more deeply. The land exhales, so do you. The night settles into something gentler now. The wind is distant, the cold no longer pressing quite so hard against the walls. You're safe enough to let your thoughts slow, safe enough to stop rehearsing dangers that aren't here anymore. As you lie there, breathing evenly, you carry the quiet knowledge of everyone who slept through storms like this before you, learning, adapting, enduring. Their nights shaped yours. Your rest honours theirs. There's nothing left to do tonight. No fire to check. No sound demanding attention. Just the steady rhythm of breath, the familiar weight of blankets, and the calm certainty that you've made it through. So let your muscles loosen. Let the vigilance fade. Sleep doesn't have to be a strategy anymore. It can just be sleep.